Got it 1122 Queen Road. Loaded weapon right there, Twisted T. Whack! Loaded weapon right there, Twisted T. Whack! Remember that video? The dude smokes that guy with one.
Hi everyone, it's Ruby G.
And I'm Joff.
Welcome to Truth in Neurons.
A loaded weapon right there. A Twisted T, quack. A laugh. Nervous, performative, just human enough to be disarming, but heavy enough to echo later. In that small laugh lies the entire anatomy of authority. Fear disguised as humour, dominance softened by a joke, violence rehearsed as entertainment. Every investigation begins with language, and language in policing can be its own kind of evidence. A casual comment about a golf club might seem like nothing, banter, dark humour, but that moment reveals something deeper about authority, symbolic aggression, and the narrative bias that shapes how power interprets the world it claims to protect. This is not merely about one phrase or one incident, it's about the architecture of mindset, the infrastructure that transforms everyday objects into weapons, citizens into threats, and justice into theatre. Every system of control begins this way, a comment, a posture, a worldview in which power is both shield and performance. The question is not whether the golf club was dangerous. The question is why someone trained to assess danger would frame it that way, and what that framing reveals about the culture that shaped them.
I can't stand here. I can't stand here and let this prosecutor... Basically, he's protecting the university at the cost of everyone. Of all you guys, all you victims. He's just basically going to protect that university. You know, Payne works for the university now, right?
Real quickly, the notes that we got with all these details, are these just Moscow police notes but no FBI notes? Well, I can't wait for those to get unsealed. I did want to ask you a quick question, though, because I'm still mystified. Yesterday in the press conference, the police said there's only one murder weapon, and it's the K-bar knife, but then there are blunt force injuries. And I know that you mentioned there's a second weapon. What did they say to you? Because in the press conference, they said, ask the families. What did they say to you about a second weapon?
I don't think that weapon murdered her. And that's the kind of games that these people are playing. It's protect the university, protect this stuff. He punched her face. He knocked her teeth out. That didn't kill her. So they're playing those kind of games with you guys.
Did he knock her teeth out?
Yeah, her teeth were busted out.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so maybe that didn't murder her. So technically, it wasn't a murder weapon.
Right.
But come on. I mean, why are you protecting a monster?
And so
is Idaho protecting the monster?
The blunt injuries that they described in the autopsy, that we think that is him with his hands, literally.
No. I think there's another weapon.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, it's rounded with stripes in it, is how it was described to us.
Rounded with stripes?
Yeah, it was a rounded object that had stripes, so it bruised her with stripes around her mouth. So she started making noises, screaming. She woke up. They said she woke up. The blood pooled in a certain way to show that she was sitting up. And he kept punching her in her face and stabbing her in the top of her head.
Jesus Christ, what an animal.
Yeah, this is who they protect.
When the officer calls a harmless object a loaded weapon, he's not merely describing the club. He's describing his internal world, a landscape in which danger is everywhere, and he stands as its perpetual gatekeeper. This is not corruption in the traditional sense. It is conditioning. But when that conditioning meets immaturity, ego fatigue, or institutional reinforcement, it mutates into something more troubling, performative toughness that mistakes aggression for competence. In cultures saturated with violence, whether military, policing, or punitive justice systems, this reflex hardens into identity. The mind begins to equate control with safety, obedience with order, and suspicion with wisdom. Once that happens, empathy is no longer a virtue. It becomes a liability, a weakness that might get you killed, or worse, get you ostracized by the brotherhood.
It betrays the interior architecture of thought, even when the speaker believes they are merely joking or venting. Quack! The cinematic echo of a movie punch is not just humour, it's fantasy rehearsal, a linguistic enactment of power and spectacle. Cops, soldiers, even surgeons use metaphor to cope with chronic exposure to violence and death. These metaphors are psychological buffers, ways of creating distance from the unbearable. It does not make someone a perpetrator, it makes them human. But it makes their language worth analysing because words are the first theatre of violence. Every later act is an echo of how we've already learned to speak. When officers, prosecutors, or politicians use war metaphors, battle, target, enemy, neutralise, they prime a culture to treat justice as combat. The shift is subtle but lethal, from serve and protect to seek and destroy. This is what's called linguistic desensitization, the slow erosion of empathy through repetition of aggressive speech. Once the words change, behaviour soon follows. The danger is not that a single officer makes a joke about a golf club. The danger is that such jokes become the vernacular of an entire subculture, normalising a worldview in which everything and everyone exists on a spectrum from threat to target. When authority becomes entertainment and violence becomes language, a society edges towards collective psychosis.
When veterans carry their training into civilian enforcement, they often bring something unspoken and unheld: moral injury. They have seen what happens when power is absolute and death is routine. They have operated in environments where the rules of engagement are clear, the enemy is defined, and survival depends on swift, overwhelming force. In uniform, again, they find themselves in a new theatre, but operating from an old script. The problem is that civilian policing is not warfare and citizens are not combatants, but the nervous system does not always know the difference. Adrenaline feels like clarity. Hierarchy feels like family. The chain of command offers the comfort of structure in a world that otherwise feels chaotic and morally ambiguous. The result is a paradox. People sworn to protect may unconsciously recreate the very battlefields they left behind. The war is over, but the body remembers. The hypervigilance, the mistrust, the need to dominate space before it dominates you. These are survival strategies that serve them in war, but become pathologies in suburban neighbourhoods and traffic stops. Moral injury is not the same as PTSD, though they often coexist. It is the weight of having been part of a system that dehumanized, that killed, that operated under legal and moral frameworks that feel impossible to reconcile in hindsight. When that gap widens and goes untreated, people numb themselves. Alcohol, cynicism, dark humour, power games, these are not vices, they are anesthetics. The tragedy is that the anesthetic becomes the identity. The officer who jokes about loaded weapons may be trying to manage pain he cannot name and a system that will not let him admit it exists.
In societies that still execute their own citizens, death is not just a sentence, it's a language. Execution tells everyone where authority ends and existence begins. It draws a line in blood and it calls it justice. Living under that regime shapes collective psychology in ways both obvious and invisible. It teaches that finality is justice, that some people are beyond redemption, and that the ultimate expression of sovereignty is the power to kill with impunity. This conditioning seeps into every layer of the justice system: policing, prosecution, sentencing, even the public's appetite for closure. The collective psyche becomes numb to nuance. The crowd cheers for retribution, not rehabilitation. When a culture sanctifies revenge and calls it righteousness, every institution begins to mimic the gallows. The officer on the street, the prosecutor in the courtroom, the commentary on television, all of them operate within a moral economy that has already decided some lives are expendable. This is not to say that all officers in such systems are executioners in waiting. It's to say that they operate within a cultural logic that makes dehumanization easier, that normalizes the idea that some people deserve to die, and that frames killing as a legitimate tool of governance. The psychological distance between this person is a threat and this person deserves to die becomes shorter with every execution the state performs. And once that distance shrinks, the threshold for legal force drops with it.
Corruption rarely looks like movie villains counting cash in dark rooms. It looks like silence, omission, and convenience. It is a favour granted because he's one of us. It is a file that disappears because it complicates things. It is a witness who recants because speaking up would cost more than staying quiet. At its root, corruption is psychological collusion, a shared story that justifies self-interest as stability, loyalty as virtue, and complicity as professionalism. Communities touched by organised crime learn this logic early. You survive by pretending not to see. You advance by pretending not to know. Eventually, denial becomes civic duty, and fear becomes so ordinary it stops registering as fear at all. It just becomes the way things are. The system protects itself not through overt violence, but through the soft power of shared silence, the implicit understanding that some questions are dangerous and some truths are too expensive to speak. This is a reality that outsiders often miss. Corruption is not always transactional. Sometimes it is relational, tribal, almost familial. It is the instinct to protect the group, even when the group has done wrong, because the group is the only thing standing between you and chaos. It is a psychological reflex to preserve the institution's image because your identity is fused with it. The authority becomes identity. Admitting fault feels like annihilation, and so the silence deepens, the records vanish, and the truth becomes whatever story the powerful can afford to tell.
When institutions withhold truth, rumour fills a vacuum. That's not ignorance, it's survival. Communities process uncertainty the way the body fights infection. With fever, speculation becomes the immune response to secrecy. People sense patterns before proof arrives because pattern recognition is an evolutionary adaptation, a way of making sense of danger when information is incomplete or deliberately obscured. In true crime culture, rumour often does what institutions fail to do. It keeps asking why when officials don't. It names what can't yet be proven. It refuses to accept the official story when the official story feels incomplete or self-serving. But rumour's danger lies in the speed and its hunger for narrative closure. It fills gaps faster than evidence can, and once a rumour takes hold, it becomes nearly impossible to dislodge, even with fact. The task is not to silence rumour, but to translate it, to understand what social anxiety it expresses and why trust collapsed in the first place. The danger is not rumour itself, but the arrogance that ignores why rumour exists. A healthy society tolerates questions. A frightened one punishes them. Transparency is not a courtesy. It is a psychological hygiene, the precondition for collective sanity. Without it, every tragedy becomes a Rorschach test and every official statement feels like gaslighting.
Systems, like people, can develop narcissistic traits. They inflate their own virtue, deny their own faults, and attack anyone who mirrors their flaws back to them. A police department, a corporation, even a nation can drift into this pathology. The signs are predictable. Grandiosity of mission.
Despite the complexity of this case, our team never wavered. They never gave up, and we completed the mission.
Hypersensitivity to criticism.
You know, there's been a lot of speculation and rumors, and what we want to say is we're the official source of information. And we want people to pay attention to what we're putting out there, because that is accurate information, and anything that comes from other sources is either rumor or speculation, and we want to put an end to that as soon as possible.
Chronic rewriting of history to preserve a spotless self-image, and refusal to acknowledge harm done in the institution's name.
Today marks the conclusion of a case that has profoundly impacted the University of Idaho, the City of Moscow, the State of Idaho, and communities nationwide. Today's sentencing of Brian Kohberger brings the legal process to a close. During this investigation, I was fortunate to witness the level of professionalism, expertise, drive, and passion that each member of the investigative team brought to the overall effort. And it was truly awe-inspiring.
Institutional narcissism is remarkably resistant to reform because it is sustained by collective investment. Everyone inside the system has a stake in the myth of its righteousness. To admit failure is to implicate oneself. The result is a culture of defensive aggression. Whistleblowers are traitors. Journalists are enemies. Critics are conspirators. The institution cannot tolerate mirrors because what it would see is unbearable. Not evil necessarily, but mediocrity, cowardice, complicity. The realization that it is not heroic, but merely human, not infallible, but deeply flawed, not protecting society, but often protecting itself. That is a narcissistic wound, and it will fight to avoid it with every tool at its disposal.
The phrase still echoes.
Loaded weapon right there, twisted T. Whack!
The real weapon is not the object in the room, it's the mindset that sees everything as potential combat, that frames the world as a theatre of threat, that mistakes domination for protection. What begins as a throwaway comment ends up being prophetic, not because it predicts the violence, but because it reveals how violence already lives in language, in posture, in the tiny performances of authority that accumulate into culture. In this sense, the body tells one story, but the culture tells another. And until we learn to read both, until we develop the literacy to decode not just what was done, but how it was spoken about, justified, normalized, justice remains half blind. The antidote is consciousness. Slow, difficult art of noticing how we speak, how we justify, how we look away. It's the practice of asking not just who is guilty, but what systems made guilt possible, what cultures made cruelty ordinary, what silences made truth unspeakable. Until that awareness is practiced collectively, the loaded weapon remains cocked in every society that worships control, mistakes authority for wisdom, and calls its fear by the name of order.
That's all for today's episode of Truth and Neurons. If you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the ethics of media commentary in high-profile cases. Until next time, keep thinking critically and questioning everything. Cheers, bye.